You're listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and education institute making law work for people, places, and the planet. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support our work, consider donating at eli.org/donate.
Welcome back to this week's episode of People, Places, Planet. I'm your host, Sarah Backer. This is the third installment of our plant-based proteins mini-series. Last time, we discussed how municipalities can begin to measure emissions from food and include plant-based protein actions in their climate action plans. As a reminder, due to their relatively low carbon footprint per gram of protein, plant-based proteins provide an excellent opportunity to minimize the carbon impact of our food. And including plant-based protein measures in municipal climate action plans is a great first step. Joining me to host this series is my colleague Linda Bregan, Senior Attorney and Director for the Center for State and Local Governance at ELI. Welcome back, Linda.
Great to be back, Sarah.
So, as you may recall, we developed a toolkit for incorporating plant-based protein measures in municipal climate action plans. And this toolkit is designed to equip municipal staff and partners with the resources needed to include plant-based protein actions in their climate action plans. And our toolkit provides a wide range of examples, some borrowed from existing municipal plans, and some that we created here at ELI.
Yes, Sarah. And again, the toolkit focuses on two distinct ways municipalities can advance plant-based proteins. The first is by increasing their availability, which we're going to talk about today. And the second is by engaging the public on their benefits.
Linda, I know that we have some incredible municipal staff who will be joining us to talk about how they design measures to increase the availability of plant-based proteins. But can you provide an example of what exactly that means?
Drawing from the actions in our toolkit, two examples of ways that a municipality can increase availability are, for example, one, through modifying their municipal procurement process in some way, and second, by encouraging private restaurants to increase their plant-based offerings. And as you said, Sarah, we'll be hearing from on-the-ground decision makers about these and other innovative ways they've been increasing the availability of plant-based proteins in their cities and towns. And these include ambitious as well as incremental actions, because there really is no one-size-fits-all approach. And fortunately, there are many options to choose from.
We will also be hearing from behavioral science experts, which I know is super thrilling for you, Linda, since you are a behavioral science buff.
Well, that is true, Sarah. I do think that applying lessons learned from the behavioral science research can really help environmental initiatives ensure greater success. But more on that later.
So our first guest is Rachel Atchison, the Deputy Director of the New York City Mayor's Office of Food Policy. And she is also one of our toolkit reviewers, so thanks, Rachel. And as background for our listeners, New York City is really leading the way forward on plant-based policy and initiatives. New York City is one of the first, if not the first, U.S. city to pledge to reduce emissions from municipal food, with a goal of 33% reduction by 2030. And they've also challenged their nonprofit and private sector partners to reduce their food emissions by 25% by 2030. A large part of reaching this goal is through increasing the availability of plant-based proteins. So welcome, Rachel. We are so excited to have you on and to hear a little bit more about what New York City is doing.
Thanks so much for having me.
To start off, can you tell us more about why and how New York City decided to set food emissions reduction targets?
So to give a bit of a backstory for New York City, we have a very plant-forward approach to our food policy, and that is really informed by, one, the current data and research, but two, the individual story of our current mayor, Mayor Eric Adams. He had a type 2 diabetes scare that was pretty intense and was able to reverse his type 2 diabetes in a few months. And so that really started us on a journey of figuring out, how do we as government not feed the crisis around food? And so what folks do in their free time, how they eat at a barbecue in the backyard, is really none of our business. What is our business is what we're serving in schools, hospitals, jails, homeless shelters, and older adult centers. And so when we decided to look at our hospital system and figure out, how could we nudge people and move them in a more plant-forward direction? It meant, how do we change the chef special? The chef special is the highlighted dish each day. And we decided to move that chef special from being a meat-based chef special to being a plant-based chef special. And we found that when we did that in the first year of implementation, we reduced our carbon emissions by 36%. That simple act of changing the default went from a world where 1% of people were opting for a plant-based meal to one where 50% of people were sticking with that plant-based meal. And we had wonderful satisfaction. We ended up saving money because of the shorter supply chain. It was just a win-win-win. And it was a way that we found out that we could reduce our food emissions and by a substantial number like 36. And so we looked at what were other municipalities doing, and other folks had signed on to the Cool Food Pledge. And so we decided to look at that cool food number, 25% reduction by 2030, and take it to the next level and go to 33%. So we have decided to reduce our carbon emissions by 33% by 2030.
Wow, Rachel, that is so incredible that you are able to achieve those reductions simply by making the plant-based option available. You've definitely alluded to this, but can you tell us more about how New York City is making them more available?
Absolutely. So we have in our food standards, which are in essence a more rigorous USDA dietary guidelines, we actually have a mandate to reduce the amount of red meat that we're serving and increase the amount of plant-based proteins that we're serving. In the 2023 revision of the New York City food standards, we actually are requiring that city agencies serve a plant-based protein once a week for lunch and once a week for dinner for the establishments that serve dinner. And so we are seeing more plant-based proteins served in our schools through our Plant Powered Friday initiative. We're seeing more plant-based proteins served in our hospitals through our plant-based default program for inpatient meals. We're seeing them served more in our jails. So Rikers Island is actually about to embark upon a culinary training to serve more delicious plant-based meals. We're seeing them served more in our homeless shelters and in our older adult centers, again, to meet that requirement in the food standards for a plant-based protein to be served once a week for lunch, once a week for dinner.
Thanks for sharing that, Rachel. Can you tell us a bit more about what these meals look like? We saw that New York City has been serving what look like delicious and nutritious meals to students at elementary schools. Nothing like the sloppy joes I was served in the school cafeteria when I was young.
So the foods look like foods that you know and love. They're from different cultures. So for instance, from the Indian culture, we are serving a kidney bean rajma. It's a very normal cuisine to be served in an Indian household, maybe not in other cultures, but we're exposing students to more and more different types of proteins. Really, the focal point of our work is centered on deliciousness. So we are doing taste tests like never before. We're exploring what adding taste panels to our contracting process looks like. We are figuring out how can we make this journey that we're going on as a country, as a world, how can we make it more delicious?
I absolutely love the frame deliciousness centered. It is so important to focus on making these meals taste great. So you mentioned the health benefits, but can you tell us more about the other benefits of increasing the availability of these foods?
So some of the benefits for us of increasing the availability of plant-based proteins includes focusing on the food and climate conversation. So making sure that we're looking both at carbon emissions, but also at other ways in which the environmental sustainability of our food system comes into account. So whether that's looking at biodiversity, or water use or land use, there's a lot that comes at play. For us, it is also very much a health push around how do we get people to eat more fiber. We as a country, I think, are probably too focused on the protein conversation when protein is not what we are lacking as much as we are lacking fiber. And so for us, serving more plant-based proteins, and again, this is not some sort of radical transformation. We're serving it once a week for lunch, once a week for dinner. It's a step in the right direction, but it is definitely not going to radically transform our food system overnight. But we are doing this for environmental reasons. We're doing this for health reasons, and we're very proud of that.
Thanks, Rachel. There really are so many benefits. Now let's turn to the challenges. What difficulties have you faced in rolling out your plant-based protein initiatives?
Thankfully, because of the leadership of the mayor, because of the leadership of both the first Deputy Mayor Wright, as well as our Deputy Mayor for Strategic Initiatives, Almanzar, and because of our Executive Director at the Mayor's Office of Food Policy, Kate McKenzie, because leadership has bought in, we have had many less hurdles than we normally potentially could have encountered on this journey. We have been very thoughtful about how we portray this. And so at the beginning, when we first launched our Plant Powered Friday initiative, we actually made the mistake of launching it as Vegan Fridays. We didn't name it. Actually, a lot of newscasters named it that when they saw the menus. But once we figured out that that was not the sort of branding that was the most appealing, we quickly redid the branding to be focused on plant powered. And so that is our branding for our school system, and each of our other sort of operations is really focused on what are the meals? How delicious are they? Are they culturally appropriate? And so we had that learning for, what to call it. But at the end of the day, the challenges really are, how do we move away from the stigma that people have of what is a plant-based protein to, okay, let's taste this meal. Let us compare it on its merits and really figure out what spices are necessary to have these dishes taste good. There's an enormous culinary feat when you serve a delicious plant-based meal. And so really leveraging the culinary community, and that's what we've been able to do with partnerships like Wellness in the Schools. They have brought in chefs, and we had a chef's council develop recipes that we would serve in schools that are culturally appropriate. It's about utilizing the entire ecosystem that wants to advance this mission. That's what we've been doing in all of our institutions.
Rachel, I really love how pragmatic New York City has been in its approach. For cities that may be smaller and less well-resourced than New York City, do you have any ideas of easy ways to make plant-based proteins more available?
For cities who are smaller, maybe less resourced, I'd say really it's about taking that next step. So not thinking grandiosely, how do I revolutionize the food system, but thinking very pragmatically, what is the logical next step? If you serve meat with every meal in your institution, let's look at what does increasing that to one plant-based day a week. If you are already serving a plant-based day, how do we increase the percentage of people who are embracing this meal? Do we do samplings? Do we do taste testings? Have we gotten the media to come and do a positive story on this journey that we're taking? I think it's really about aligning all of your actors in the space, aligning all of your champions in the food policy arena to be supportive of this work and row in the same direction. I'd encourage them to look at everything in their toolbox, whether it's hospital meals, whether it's teaming up with local nonprofits who can come in and do outside interventions. We've teamed up with Plant Powered Metro New York, a local nonprofit who comes in and gives our nutritionists some trainings. They put on a staff jumpstart of 21 days of plant-based eating. It's really about trying to figure out who is in your network and how can we leverage their skill set to move us forward. So we've got a couple of food and school nonprofits like New Roots Institute, like the Coalition for Healthy School Food, like Wellness in the Schools, who are each really boosting the work with groups like Green Bronx Machine or with Harlem Grown. We know that if kids grow the food, they're much more likely to eat the food. And so leverage these different pieces of information of the ecosystem to really boost the movement as a whole. So I think it's about figuring out who is in your corner and how you can add more allies into the mix.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. It was wonderful to hear about how New York City is helping lead the charge on increasing the availability of plant-based proteins. Now we're going to head down south to speak to another city that is spearheading plant-forward initiatives. Angela Baucom joins us from Austin, Texas, where she is the Food and Climate Program Coordinator for Austin's Office of Sustainability. Angela, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for making the City of Austin a part of your conversations.
So, Angela, there are a few actions in the Austin Climate Equity Plan that are designed to increase the availability of plant-based foods. Before we deep dive into them, can you tell us more about this climate equity plan and how it differs from the more typical climate action plan?
Austin did previously have a more traditional climate action plan, but when we were looking at revising that plan, we wanted to be sure to acknowledge the fact that Austin has a history that has deep foundations in conflict, displacement, land theft, slavery, and to this day, ongoing discrimination. So we now recognize the impacts and ongoing effects of redlining, gentrification, and both the willful and inadvertent underserving of sections of our city. We have seen the displacement, especially of people of color in our community, resulting in a shrinking Black population, relocation of residents of color to areas where there's excessive heat, poor air quality, food access, and transportation barriers. When we moved into this new phase of climate planning, equity was essential to keep at the center of all of our conversations and prioritizing the areas and conditions and people who are experiencing adverse health outcomes as a result of the conditions of our city at large. So we wrote this commitment into our climate equity plan. The plan itself says that we will not perpetuate historical inequities, and we will ensure that all programs are accessible to and preferably initiated and led by people of color and those with limited economic power, since those are the folks that are most disproportionately impacted.
Thanks, Angela. It is really interesting to hear about the foundations of your climate equity plan and the city's commitment to keeping equity at the center of all conversations, as well as prioritizing the areas, conditions, and people that are experiencing adverse health outcomes. On a related topic, can you tell us more about your process? How did you go about choosing the plant-based related actions in your plan?
The process of choosing these items was really founded in community engagement. As anyone who works in government will tell you, community engagement is completely necessary and often nearly impossible when you look at all of the time and the resources that need to go into it. It is urgent that we have voices in the room that represent those most impacted. And it's also urgent that we get these plans and strategies out the door and in action, because we need to change the lives of people now. So we really focused in the climate equity plan on bringing people who could share passion, expertise, and a presence in the community. Those folks were tasked with coming up with the specific actions that would be most impactful and meaningful in those areas. The climate equity plan had direct edits and input from nearly 200 community members, so that community-led advisory group helped to craft those goals and strategies. There is a section of the climate equity plan that is specifically around food and consumption. The goal that most particularly references those plant-based foods is around what we call pro-climate, pro-health diets. So pro-climate, pro-health means that we are looking at things that nourish the body as well as the planet.
Thanks, Angela, for letting us in on your process. It's really great that you took the time and the effort to meaningfully involve the community, which, as you pointed out, is quite a difficult task. Can you tell us more about the different plant-based priorities in the plan?
We've got priorities in the areas of institutional food purchasing, promoting and funding community-driven food retail, and then incentivizing informed choice. And we place an emphasis on the affordability and accessibility, recognizing that choice doesn't only incorporate an individual's decision, it incorporates the environment in which we operate. And that's an economic environment, a social environment, and just the accessibility factors that are influenced by outside infrastructure, transportation, heat and walkability of these resources, availability within local retail. There are many pieces that we try to take into account.
It's really great that you're taking a thoughtful, holistic approach here. Can you speak more to Austin's institutional food purchasing efforts?
We started with the Good Food Purchasing Program as a guideline. Good Food Purchasing Program is a values-based purchasing structure, and it identifies values across the food system that we can ground our work in, and we can identify ways to create a more transparent and accountable food supply chain. We were tasked with developing ways of engaging with either the Good Food Purchasing Program or a similar structure in order to promote that accountability throughout Austin. We have partnered over the last several years with large-scale food purchasers. The city of Austin is a little bit unique in that we don't have purchasing control over, for example, our hospital system or our school districts. All of our school districts are independent school districts, ISDs. So Austin Independent School District, for example, is a very large independent purchasing entity. They have their own sway over the market. Our hospital systems have their own sway. Our large-scale distributors have their own sway. And so we've been able to partner well with the Sustainable Food Center. They have helped us to bring together a coalition of parties. And now the Sustainable Food Center oversees that coalition and convenes people to have meaningful conversation about what are the barriers to participating in values-based purchasing. I think bringing together partners and convening these groups has been absolutely crucial to moving towards goals in this area.
Thanks so much, Angela. It's really wonderful that you're making strides in reducing the climate impact of municipal food. Does your plan have any actions geared towards businesses and the private sector?
We have identified a few methods for getting information to folks and encouraging businesses to participate in adopting more pro-climate, pro-health food choices. We are now building up momentum, engaging in more sponsorships and partnerships. For example, partnering with Planted Society and Better Food Foundation around the Plant-Based for the Planet event, which just happened in January. We have a food justice mini grant where we fund organizations from grassroots to for-profit entities to individuals to co-ops with a small amount of stimulus funding to implement innovative solutions that are rooted in that food justice mindset. There might be tools that haven't yet been considered or instituted on a large scale, like a menu labeling scheme that would more universally describe the climate impact of a food that you see in a restaurant or at a food business. We've talked to businesses that have expressed lots of different feelings about this sort of application. And we realize now that one of the things that we could do better in future planning efforts is to investigate the implementation steps. We could look closer at how these things are going to happen in practice and make sure that everyone who's involved in making those things happen is engaged in the planning process from the start.
Thanks, Angela. And, in that vein, are there any lessons learned from challenges that you can impart to other cities looking to incorporate similar measures in their plans?
We have learned a lot of hard lessons. We've learned that we need to be very conscientious about our language. Plant-based can communicate different things to different folks. We know that people see different things in those words and their perceived sentiments around language. Having that diversity of voices in the community engagement period really allowed us to bring those priorities into focus, hear the ways in which different folks were ingesting those words, and help us to put out clear language that was going to communicate our priorities in a way that would bring people in rather than pushing people away.
Well, Angela, it's been great to have you on the podcast today. And before we wrap up, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
When it comes to plant-based, we are probably in an easier situation than some other cities even though we are in Texas and we value our barbecue, we value this trendy food scene, we do have a community that values progressive ideas. And we also identify that we have a community that values accessibility of food and resources. Time and time again, what we hear when we talk about plant-based food is, yeah, but people need food first before you can tell them what kinds of foods to choose. And we're not disagreeing with that. In fact, we have some wonderful national data that identifies how more plant-based or plant-forward food systems are a path to addressing food insecurity. Plant-forward food systems are a source of higher quality and higher quantity of calories that are accessible to people who need them. We can not only reduce the climate impact of our food system, but we can benefit the health of our community, and we can reduce so many of those downstream effects of our current food system by focusing on food differently, by eating differently and creating a culture shift. But all that to say that when it comes to talking about how to create that culture shift, we had to focus locally. We had to really listen to what people were saying in reaction to what we put out. And talking about an emphasis on plant-based menu defaults, for example, was something that excited people. So I think that that is the greatest piece of advice that I could possibly reflect back, is that when we're listening and when we're using the words of our community, especially when it comes to something that can stir up controversy like plant-based eating, we're going to do best when we are saying the words that resonate with the community, that come from this place-based effort that has been created. Every city has a language, and our language comes from huge convergence of dedicated people who gave us feedback at every step. Right now, where we are in our conversations, acknowledging that we are never trying to take resources away from our Texas ranchers who we love and who are going to make a huge difference in our food system going forward, never wanting to take away from the incredibly rich history of farming, never wanting to take away from the roots of a beautiful food landscape that has existed far before Austin was Austin, far before Texas was Texas. We are still responsible for our reach. We can have an impact on our purchasing decisions right now, and we can start small internally. And I think that that's something that I will always embrace.
It was great to hear how Austin is leveraging its purchasing power and engaging businesses. As we mentioned earlier in the episode, sustainability practitioners across the country, such as Rachel and Angela, are borrowing lessons from the social science literature in their work. Individual dietary choices and human behavior generally, as we well know, is complicated and a challenge to understand. But there is a growing body of behavioral research in a range of disciplines, from social and cognitive psychology to behavioral economics, that provides some insights about ways in which to make plant-based proteins more available. And to tell us more about these key lessons from behavioral science, we're joined by Katie Cantrell, the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Greener by Default. Welcome, Katie.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
To start off, can you tell us a little bit about Greener by Default?
Yes. So Greener by Default is a nonprofit that empowers institutions to implement behavioral science strategies to nudge diners towards more plant-based options. At our core, what we're trying to do is flip the norm in institutional food service. Right now, most everywhere meat is the default, and people have to specially opt into plant-based options, which usually only strict vegetarians and vegans bother to do. We're working to make plant-based the default and give people the choice to opt into meat and dairy. This makes plant-based options really easy and accessible and appealing for all diners while still preserving freedom of choice.
what have you found are best practices for trying to increase the availability of plant-based proteins?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that municipalities can encourage people to consume more plant-based proteins to make them more widely available. So one is to really walk the walk themselves. So passing a plant-based default for public meetings that are held, if there's a city council or a board of commissioners, that their meetings, if they are serving food, that plant-based is the default. This is not forcing everyone to eat plant-based foods, but making that the norm unless people specially opt out of it and request a meat-based meal. That's one way that really sets a very strong precedent and sends a message to local institutions saying that we believe this is best practice. And we are not just saying that, but we are actively doing it ourselves. There's also a lot of other opportunities depending on the types of food procurement that the municipality engages in. That might be the Department of Corrections, potentially schools, potentially hospitals. And there's a lot of great strategies for increasing plant-based procurement across all of those different types of institutions.
So these plant-based defaults seem to be incredibly effective, Katie. As we saw in New York City, defaults have led public hospitals to reduce emissions from food by 36%. And the great thing about defaults and other nudges is that they simply expand consumer choice options, right? So are there other behavioral science techniques that can be used to increase availability?
Defaults are really the gold standard in terms of behavioral science. They have the largest impact. So again, making plant-based the default, giving people the choice to opt out into meat. That can look like if people are RSVPing for an event, having language saying that the food will be plant-based by default, please let us know if you would prefer a meat meal. If there's coffee being served, like at a coffee bar, having a sign that says all drinks are made with oat milk by default, let us know if you'd prefer dairy, almond, or soy milk. That default intervention can switch up to 60 to 80 percentage point of meals or drinks served from animal-based to plant-based. So defaults, again, are really the most impactful intervention, but they're not always possible in every food service environment. For instance, they're harder to implement, although not impossible, in cafeterias or all-you-care-to-eat environments. Also, if there's not an opt-out option, like if there's only one meal that's being served and no other choice, then defaults aren't a viable strategy. So when defaults aren't possible, there's a variety of other behavioral science interventions that we recommend. Some of those include choice architecture, so looking at the order in which dishes are presented on a menu, making sure that the plant-based options are incorporated into the main menu rather than being in a separate menu. What happens when there's a separate vegan menu or a separate vegan station or a vegan table at a buffet is that then you get this natural division where the vegans and vegetarians will go there, but the omnivores will think, oh, that's just for the vegans. I'm not a vegan. It's not for me. And so then they will stick with the normal meat option. And so, of course, we want to make the plant-based options seem relevant and appealing to everyone. So incorporating that into the main menu, listing it first and last also tends to increase the uptake. Also, really simple strategies like changing the name of a dish so that it doesn't have vegan or vegetarian or meatless listed prominently in the title. So you also don't want to give them a name that indicates that this dish is just for vegans. So an omnivore is likely to look at that vegan burrito and think, again, I'm not a vegan, it's not for me. But if they were to see a Fiesta black bean and sweet potato burrito, then, oh, I love those flavors. That sounds delicious. I might choose it without even thinking about the fact that it's plant-based. A good analogy for this is if you were to look at a menu and see a celiac bowl, you're probably not likely to choose it unless you're strictly gluten-free. Whereas if you see a Thai peanut rice noodle bowl, if you like those flavors, sounds delicious, you'll choose that without even thinking about the fact that it is gluten-free. So again, looking at all of these little strategies that we can use to make sure that the plant-based options are really as appealing as possible for all diners, getting outside of that paradigm that vegetarian food is just for vegetarians.
Thank you, Katie. It's really interesting to think about the impact that framing and other approaches are having now and can have on what people eat every day. Are there resources that you would point municipalities to for them to learn more about these kind of strategies?
Yes, absolutely. So on our website, greenerbydefault.org, we have a research section that talks about all of the different studies behind the strategies that we recommend. There's also a really fantastic resource from Friends of the Earth called Meat of the Matter, on municipal procurement of climate-friendly foods. And that really gets into not necessarily behavioral science, but really the policy side of things and how to feasibly implement different strategies across different types of procurement. Also, the World Resources Institute has a really fantastic playbook, and they just came out with a new version. They have about 90 some odd strategies that are rooted in behavioral science to help with creating more climate-friendly menus. So all of the strategies that we recommend are a subset of the World Resources Institute strategy. So if you want to see kind of our small subset, you can look at our website. If you want to see that full list, then WRI's new playbook is a really fantastic resource.
Katie, it's been great to have you on the podcast today. Any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
It's very, very complex and can be a very sensitive topic. But the beauty of food as an intervention is that we all eat 3 times a day. So this is something that we can all participate in. And it can actually be a much more inclusive way to bring people into the sustainability conversation. You know, people who are renting houses can't put solar panels on their roof. Most people can't afford electric cars, but we can all eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich instead of a bologna sandwich, or make black bean chili instead of beef chili. So this is actually a really great starting point for engaging people in a way that they can do directly and that we can all do together. And I think especially when it's presented as defaults or something that we can all choose to do more often, rather than that black and white of, oh, you have to go fully vegetarian or we're going fully meatless for our menus, then it feels a lot more inclusive and accessible to people. And so I think municipalities can play a really critical role in helping both individuals and institutions in the community to realize that this doesn't have to be something that's very controversial and actually can be a way to bring people together.
I once again want to thank Rachel, Angela, and Katie for being on the podcast today. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. This has been ELI's Plant-Based Protein mini-series, produced in conjunction with our toolkit. Check it out in the show notes and join us for the next episode of People, Places, Planet.
Thanks for listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute. Our work wouldn't be possible without the support of people like you. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, attend one of our events, or support our work financially, head to eli.org.